He's the president and CEO of the Bullitt Foundation out of Seattle, Washington. They're an environmental foundation. He's also an environmental lawyer, but he's probably best known for being the first coordinator of Earth Day back in 1970. Dennis Hayes, thank you for joining us.
Lee, it's a pleasure to be here.
Now let's set the stage for our audience. It's 1970. There's no environmental protection agency as of yet. The environmental movement is basically save the whales and save the baby seals, but really nothing when it comes to urban settings for chemical waste dumps or clean water. How did you get started in the Earth Day event?
Well, the roots of it all trace to Senator Gaylord Nelson, who decided that he wanted to try to propel basically the conservation and the environmental issue to a higher degree of prominence that it enjoyed.
As we develop our technology to refine wastes, we will begin to enhance the quality of the air and the water.
So he set out to try to create a set of teach-ins on college campuses. I was at that point a graduate student at Harvard, came down to Washington to see if I could get the charter to organize Harvard. Turned out he'd had a tremendous response from a great many people, and it was overwhelming his office, and he decided to sort of set up a separate organization that would be responsible for coordinating these things. So I went back with the charter to organize Boston, got a call 2 days later saying, would you come down and organize the United States? And from there on it just grew.
So you were roughly, what, 25, 26 years old?
I was 25, 26. And the interesting thing as it evolved is that it turned out environmental teaching just didn't work. People were concerned about the environment. And as you said, it was a series of issues. There were people that worried about pesticides, worried about wetlands, worried about freeways cutting through their neighborhoods, worried about the traditional conservation issues. But none of them thought of themselves as part of something bigger than their narrow interest. So what Earth Day evolved into was something to tie them all together, to weave those strands into the fabric of modern environmentalism.
Now, we always think about when events such as Earth Day, when they first started, that they started small, but you had 20 million people participating. This is 1970, so our country doesn't have 300 million people at that point. 20 million is a large percentage of the U.S. participating.
About 1/10.
How did you organize that at age 26?
Oh, it was 25.
25.
The media then was actually relatively cooperative. We, of course, didn't have the internet, we didn't have social networking, we didn't have modern telephony, and particularly we focused a lot upon women's magazines. It turned out the most responsive part of the American public was women, and single wage earner families, typically college educated, typically a couple young kids, and this issue really grabbed them. So we went out through Ladies' Home Journal, and we went out through Cosmopolitan, we went out through everything. And almost all of those articles in magazines and, interestingly, in newspapers put our address and telephone number on the bottom of the offices in Washington.
The Associated Press did a poll in 1969. Less than 10% of the American public considered environmental issues important. After 1970, right after Earth Day, it was more than 25% considered it important. Now, that's a huge impact for an organization that was just starting up.
This was something that could draw most Americans together. I mean, there wasn't a huge lobby out there saying, look at that smokestack and that beautiful billow of smoke coming out and poisoning us, let's do more. And so it was easy to pull Americans around, and the nation was desperately in search of something that would bind some of its wounds together.
But this was coming out of the tail end of the 60s. Was there any sort of image problem that you had that Earth Day was just a bunch of hippies wanting to make shirts out of hemp?
Well, there certainly were early critics. In one notable occasion, I was accused of working for the CIA to diffuse the anti-war movement, although I'd spent the previous 2 years of my life totally immersed in the anti-war movement. But I think as the event progressed, all of that criticism subsided, and people began really to understand, at least, if you will, the most intense organizers understood the true, profound challenges involved in environmentalism, which is basically an attack upon unconstrained growth. It's an attack upon introducing tens of thousands of chemicals without running toxicological tests on them. It's an attack in ways about the way that post-World War II business was operating. The anti-war movement, which tended to think it was radical, was basically stop the war. Stop the war and nothing much changes. As part of the environmental movement, we were talking about profound, lasting changes that totally reorient society. I think it's no great exaggeration to say that the laws that passed between 1970 and 1974 achieved the greatest changes in the nature of the American economy since the New Deal.
Now, the environmental movement made its natural progression into to energy issues in the United States, mid-70s, mid-80s. And tell us how that evolved, how the environment and energy became interlocked when it comes to Earth Day.
Well, it has both a philosophical and intellectual basis and a pragmatic basis. Intellectually, the environmental movement is rooted in the science of ecology, and the whole science of ecology is a set of principles for how you govern and operate in a realm of scarce energy. Energy from the sun that becomes food through photosynthesis and runs everything on the planet except human beings, since we started tapping into fossil fuels. Actually, it was human beings too until the Industrial Revolution. At the practical level, it's that there were power plants that were producing just huge numbers of toxics, of acid rain, of mercury that were coming down on the surrounding communities. It was the coal that was being burned in steel mills and in automobile factories, the sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide that poured out of paper mills. It was the gasoline consumed by the cars that were producing in Los Angeles so much air pollution that living and breathing in Los Angeles was like smoking a couple packs of cigarettes a day, which if you are a 2-month-old baby is a pretty dangerous activity to engage in. And all of that stuff tied together, and then the nuclear issue came in, and they started siting nuclear power plants near communities like Dresden outside of Chicago. Suddenly there was this huge opposition to the dangers that were posed by that. And then finally in 1973-74 there was the Arab oil embargo, catapulted energy into a very prominent position, and the environmental attributes of energy production became central to the debate.
In 1990, Earth Day went global. You started expanding to other countries, and now, last year, Earth Day had 1 billion people participate. It's the largest secular event in the world.
No other secular holiday around the world brings out as many people. And the trip down from Boston to Washington, even had I had the wildest dream that I'd be asked to coordinate the United States, wouldn't have led to anything like this because it was a one-time event. We were going to be doing this in 1970. We were going to raise these issues to national consciousness, and then it would be over, just like the Poor People's March happened one time, or the March on the Pentagon happened one time, or all of these other events. But then it turned out in 1971, a number of the organizers who had done things in local areas wanted to do it again. And in particular, we had that first time about 15,000 K-12 schools where they'd taken students out and gone to a wetland and studied ecology or picked up litter or planted trees, and the teachers kept on doing that. And it was sort of like a flywheel. It had its own momentum. I actually slightly tried to stop it in 1971 because I knew it couldn't be as big as 1970, and the media would say, well, the bloom is off the rose, the environmental movement's fading. But it kept on going, and then when we jumped in particularly in 1990 and started putting resources to it, and addressing the big global issues, the ones that transcend national borders, like climate change and threats to the world's oceans and the population issue and the epidemic of extinction going around the planet, then it began to swell into this big annual event.
And also you have television networks that run their news agencies. They cover green topics this week. They do this every year. They turn over their whole network to green issues. Our network, Clean Skies News, was launched on Earth Day 2 years ago. So it even has an effect in the media, too.
Mm-hmm. And for the most part, those things are all very good. We get criticized a lot because there are often green claims that are made on Earth Day and Earth Week that, to be generous, are not always fully substantiated. But I think that the American public and even the global public has developed a crap detector, and if somebody puts up a banner that says every day is Earth Day at Exxon, they kind of disregard it.
Time magazine named him one of the heroes of the planet. He's Denis Hayes. Denis, thank you for joining us here on Clean Skies.
Lee, it was a pleasure.
I'm Lee Patrick Sullivan, and you're watching Clean Skies News.